Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, you know the difference between the two statistics the government uses to measure inflation, don't you? The RPI and the CPI? Of course you do. But just in case, both the Retail Prices Index and the Consumer Prices Index look at how much prices are increasing. But they are calculated in different ways, and that means the RPI is generally higher. So why does this matter to you? Well, rail fares are going up 3.6% in January, and the interest rate on student loans has risen to 6.1%. These are both linked to the higher RPI rate of inflation, and some believe it's a way for the government to rip off you, the consumer. But is it? Helen Thomas has been taking a look.
RPI is a bit of a statistical relic. It was created in 1947, when rationing was in and supermarkets were newfangled. But to many economists, the Retail Prices Index is well past its best, and to most consumers, it's just a few letters. And what's one more? Replace the R with C, and it becomes the Consumer Prices Index. Both track the rise in prices of a basket of goods and services. But there's good reason to take an interest in why they're different. Commuters should care. The government links rises in regulated rail fares to RPI, which in July was 3.6%. Students should care too. Interest on their loans is linked to RPI. What's peculiar about this is that RPI is widely seen as a flawed measure.
The RPI lost its status as a national statistic in 2013, and there were a number of weaknesses identified that means that RPI tends to be higher than other measures of inflation. So overall, we do not see the RPI as a good measure of inflation, and we strongly discourage people from using it.
This line shows the difference between RPI and CPI. In the financial crisis, as interest rates were slashed, RPI briefly fell below CPI. But otherwise, RPI has consistently been higher, and that could leave the nation's commuters and students feeling rather ripped off.
There may only be one letter in it, but actually there are three big differences between RPI and CPI. The first is how they measure housing costs. RPI, for example, includes mortgage interest payments, whereas CPI does not. The second is who is covered. RPI excludes some of the highest earners and some of the poorest households, whereas CPI effectively covers everyone. But the third one is the big one, the formula. The two are just worked out differently.
To produce the price index, the government has to collect, I think, about 250,000 prices every month. The method that they use for some parts of the retail price index is known to create an upward bias. Things go up more than they come down, and for that reason the International Labour Office, which offers international guidelines on how to compile price indices, has been saying for decades that this measure shouldn't be used.
Despite this, the government says it has no plans to change its policies. But why not, given that the government itself also gets stung? It pays interest on hundreds of billions of pounds worth of index-linked government bonds. Those interest payments are also linked to RPI. Meanwhile, the Office of National Statistics just has to keep publishing it.
We are required by law to publish the Retail Prices Index, but we also know that there are a number of long-term contracts, many signed a long time ago, that use the Retail Prices Index. So stopping it would simply not be practical. Our approach has instead been to develop other measures that are better measures of inflation that people can use instead of the RPI.
my sense is that, if anything, the problems of the retail price index are going to get worse rather than better as shopping habits change, and I think it would be much better for the government to address and resolve the problem than for the government, the British government, to carry on publishing a statistic which is known to be flawed.
Rail companies, bond investors, the student loans market could all surely adapt, while the taxpayer could stand to benefit. Perhaps it's time to consign RPI to history.
Joining me now are Jill Leyland, a former Vice President of the Royal Statistical Society, and Ben Southwood from the Adam Smith Institute. If I could come to you first, Ben. Consumers are going to feel a dent in their pocket if they are being hit by these rail price increases, or students similarly in the way we've just discussed. Are they being ripped off by the government?
Well, in a sense they are. As was adequately shown there, RPI is a bad measure of true inflation, although true inflation is an abstract concept really, and all we have are measures. The point is that because RPI comes in slightly high, it has allowed the government to achieve a couple of political goals, which I agree with, which is shifting the burden of rail onto those who use it and not the general taxpayer, so lightening the burden on the taxpayer and raising it on those who use tickets. So it's gone up from about 55% of a ticket is paid by the person who uses the train to 65%. Still about 35% is paid by the taxpayer.
And students?
Students repay about 55% again of their loans, and the government pays about 45% of that. Now, if we charged them less, then the government would pick up more of the cost of the student's education. There's a reasonable case for that, but I think a student who benefits from a degree, there's a reasonable case for them paying for that degree.
Jill, where do you stand on this? Is it time for the government to retire RPI?
It can't retire RPI for a number of reasons, because it is used in many contracts, private and public sector ones as well. It's not always quite as bad as it's painted. There are advantages to it. For example, it was designed to measure inflation as experienced by households, whereas CPI was designed for macroeconomic purposes. So CPI is very good, for example, as the target rate for the Bank of England, but it's not so good if you want to actually measure the impact of inflation on households.
But people really, at the end of the day, don't care about how things are indexed. They care about the bottom line in their bank balance. And if they hear here, even though you agree with the reason potentially, or the benefit of kind of paying off some of our debt, or people being, paying those bills that actually are using those services, even if you agree with that, the idea that they are being ripped off in some way does not make people happy.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think the government is fairly shameless in the way it uses RPI and CPI, because it tends to use CPI when it's paying out money, for example, on some benefits and public sector pensions, and it often uses RPI when people are paying out money, as with rail fares, student loans, and a number of other things.
Ben, how can you feel okay about that then, when it's put so clearly in that way? I think if I was at home, I'd be shaking my fist at the television.
Well, I don't actually think it makes that much of a difference.
Really?
Let's say you have student loans with an interest rate set as RPI plus some number. Now, let's say RPI always comes in as 0.5 percentage points above CPI.
Okay.
To make the same bank balance for the government, the same balance between taxpayers and users of the services, you just add that 0.5 percentage points on that arbitrary number you've added onto the inflation measure. It doesn't really matter which one you use. The decision is a purely political one of who bears the burden.
Well, exactly, but it's a bit shameless, as Jill says.
It is. I think it's dishonest. The other thing is it's inefficient, because the difference between RPI and CPI, as your graph very clearly showed, isn't a constant. It varies. And at times RPI has been lower than CPI. So,
but the future is no different, because you said we can't change it.
We can't. The Office for National Statistics has to keep on publishing RPI. For legal reasons, it's difficult to correct its overestimation, although it would be possible technically. So we are in a bit of a bind, which is one reason that the Office for National Statistics is creating a new index, yet another underground, but perhaps with
another
household
index.
costs index. But
we'll talk about that another time. Thank you very much to both of you.